Okay, please.
Give him maybe another minute. I sent him a quick note too. Sometime he sees it.
Oh, okay. So now he needs a big cup of coffee, though. Huh? William, it's you?
At the hour, Bill. You know how to excite people.
William, good. Good morning.
Hello.
Do you have a cup of big coffee for yourself?
I have a coffee. I am semi-awake.
Okay.
It's about the best I can say.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we can start this session. This is a very interesting session. The topic is digital sovereignty. In the beginning, let me introduce our speaker. The first of all is a Taiwan Digital Minister, the Audrey Tang. And the second one is ICANN Chairman, the bottom Bowman over there. And next is the ICANN board member and also former IETF chair, Harold Ovestren. And then the next one, we see the side face of the Erica Mann now. And Erica Mann is a former ICANN board and also the geopolitical consultant. And of course, she worked for Facebook in Europe for many years. The last one is William Drake. His face is disappeared. But anyway, he is an internet governance expert. And actually, his working proposal, he helped me to written up for this workshop. Let me introduce what we are going to talk today. As we know, the ICANN established in 1998 to deal with the DNS and also Internet Critical Resource Management. In 2003, the China Great Firewall started Golden Seal project. And it's a massive surveillance and censorship system keep enhance this project till now, even today. And the UN operated the WSIS, World Summit of the Internet Society in the 2003 in Geneva, 2005 in Tunis. And to deal with the internet critical resources, define the internet governance by the working group, the WIGIS. And start the IGF since 2006 till now. Actually, today is still the IGF session. Somehow, there's in the 2013, there's a Snowden case happened. And if I remember, that is on the February of the 17th to 2014, the Financial Times talking about Germany Chancellor, he commented about we talked with the friends about how we can maintain a high level of the data protection. Above all, we talk with the European provider that offer the security for our citizens so that one shouldn't have to send email and other information across the Atlantic. In 2013, ICANN actually initiated the idea of the one world, one internet. 2016, it's a very famous paper. It's written by William Drake, Vincent, and Wolfgang, talking about the internet fragmentation. Then surprising, the European Parliament, EPRS, they have an idea paper published, say the digital sovereignty for Europe on July 2020. So this is kind of the background for this topic, why we began to talking about the digital sovereignty. So the first round, we like to talking about the definition, is the nature of the national sovereignty and its extension to the digital sovereignty or cyberspace sovereignty. Is the digital sovereignty compatible to the globalized access provided by internet protocols? If some government push the traditional sovereignty to the cyberspace or digital sovereignty, even cross the border, could it possible to conform the principle of the traditional territory sovereignty and develop a cyber border or the cyber custom, when issues developing, and so I think the first I'd like to ask the Bill, you are in the political science. Can you give us the definition regarding for the sovereignty and what the people talking about the digital sovereignty will mean? Bill, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be with you. I wish I was there in person. It'd be much nicer to be in Taiwan than it is in Geneva, which is currently the #1 place in Europe for COVID, so not a great time. Anyway, but very interesting set of panels today. The definition of sovereignty is an interesting question, and I think it's important to start with that because there's a lot of fuzzy, agenda-driven thinking and discourse now around sovereignty. The term is being appropriated and applied to the digital space in all kinds of ways. So we're hearing about internet sovereignty, digital sovereignty, technological sovereignty, personal sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These expansive and slippery usages, I think, can be problematic, especially when invoked by states, because often states have used the term like security to justify doing just about anything they wanted. And sovereignty is easily deployed to rally tribal, nationalistic sentiments and position the state as the necessary defender and rightful beneficiary of unquestioned loyalty, which has caused a lot of problems over the years. And we'll come back to that, I guess. But just to start from first principles, I don't want to sound too theoretical at this time in the morning or afternoon, but the structure of the international political system is anarchic in the sense that there is an absence of centralized supranational authority, which means that authority devolves down to the level of individual states. Hence, in international law, sovereignty simply means states are not formally subject to other sources of legitimate public authority and can take actions accordingly. There's an external or horizontal dimension, which is that states are juridically and jurisdictionally separate and equal and enjoy the same rights and privileges as each other, and an internal or vertical dimension, which is that nation states are hierarchically organized with the state on top, exercising supreme authority over society and able to impose laws, taxes, raise armies, and so on. From a structural standpoint, states then are what you could call like units in the international system. They're alike in the tasks that they face and the functions they serve to perform. And through international interaction and emulation and domestic governance, they have progressively converged in form and developed similar structures with agencies for making, executing, and interpreting laws and regulations, raising revenues, deploying force, and so on. That said, what does sovereignty not mean? While states are all like units, they are not all alike in their capabilities and power, and hence in their abilities to perform all the functions that they would like to. States are constitutionally, legally independent and equal, but they're not operationally independent and equal. So, for example, Haiti enjoys the same legal independence as the United States, but it does not have the same operational capabilities and independence as the United States, and many other pairs of countries could be used to illustrate the same point. Every state's operational independence is constrained to some extent by limits to its capabilities and its vulnerabilities and sensitivities to external forces and interdependence. So sovereignty does not mean that states can always do whatever they please or that they are free of any external influences. Indeed, one can be sovereign and still be very dependent on others, nor does it mean that they can always get whatever they want. So in short, sovereignty means that a state has a right to pursue self-determination to decide for itself how it will cope with internal and external problems and whether or not to seek assistance from or collaborate with other states, and in so doing maybe limit its freedom of action by making commitments to them, as we all do in international agreements. But sovereignty is not a guarantee of self-determination. just like we as free individuals have a right to pursue our own self-determination, self-realization, etc., in practice, we may be constrained by external forces and events, such as, for example, COVID not allowing me to go to Taiwan, where I'd love to be right now. So we just need to be clear about this, that when people invoke the notion of digital sovereignty does not, in any real world sense, mean that states are completely independent, autarkic, able to do whatever they want, and should just go off and adopt any policies they want, regardless of the consequences. Far from it. Sovereignty simply means that states have a right to pursue a measure of self-determination and have legal rights and claims that they can make under international law in international contexts. So I think it's good to start from that standpoint and understand that sovereignty is not this expansive term that allows states to do whatever the hell they want, whenever they want. It's just not historically true. Despite that, as we'll talk about later, states have always made claims, particularly with regard to international communications and information, that sounded like indeed states had such rights to do whatever they want and ability to do whatever they want. And this has often been quite problematic in terms of the way global governance of communications and information has evolved. So I'll stop there.
Okay. The second, I'd like to ask Erica Mann. Since you are the expert in the geopolitical, also you're familiar with the European Parliament very well. What is your view about what is the European Parliament they want to do when they begin to talking about the digital sovereignty? What is the definition for them from European Parliament point of view? You didn't turn on the voice. We cannot hear you.
We can't hear you.
Please
would you like
unmute.
to unmute?
Thank you, Martin.
Good.
Thank you so much, Quo Vadis, and welcome to everyone. I was a member of the parliament myself for 15 years. I'm from Germany originally, and I'm now working in different capacities with a different entity. Just to maybe a few points. So the Parliament and the European Union. So the European Parliament, as you may know, all of you, is a body, is the legislative body of the European Union. And with the European Union, you have two items you have to focus on. So one item is the national agenda, what the national countries are doing in the European Union, and the other side is how much is this reflected on the European level. So you can't expect, if you talk about the topic of digital sovereignty, you can't expect to have across the European Union a harmonized view, but a lot depends on how European member states are shaping their national agendas. And of course, you can imagine we have still 28, soon only 27 members, when the UK completely, or the UK already left, but then it's not part of in any way, part of the European environment any longer. You can expect that these countries have always a very different view. Just compare, for example, Germany and France, and then take Martin, for example, the Netherlands, or Finland and Sweden. Each of these countries have a different perspective. So maybe just to give you some idea what they are looking into, it's still early days on the topic. Many topics are already debated, but in the form of legislation and shaping legislation, it's still quite early days. Okay. So the proposal which will come from the European Commission, who is the administrative arm, the European Commission is thinking about three topics, how to define this environment. So one is to enhance what they call computing power. Mm-hmm. The second one is to ensure control over data. Mm-hmm. And the third is to have a secure connectivity environment. So on the first one, computing power, what they want to do is to produce the world's most powerful processor, including quantum computing. Now, you can imagine that's a quite ambitious agenda. Quantum computing is around for a while, but it's typically handled in very large corporation or research entities. And I'm pretty sure Harald can talk about it later. It's not such an easy issue to enhance this into the environment of cybersecurity. They are in particular looking at the following value chains, which is the automotive car, connected devices, tablets and smartphones, supercomputers, edge computers, and artificial intelligence, and then the military, the defense environment.
You were talking about that many years ago.
No, it depends on the topic. Some topics are already debated for a while. On the defense environment, they will actually, not the defense environment, that's not correct, but the Schengen environment, so how to protect national borders and how to protect the Schengen environment. There will be a proposal delivered actually today. Some of the key member states had a meeting yesterday in combination with the European Commission and the European Council, and they said they would have deliver a proposal today. So we will have to wait.
Okay.
I haven't seen it yet. Otherwise, I could talk about it. That's the idea, how to protect the Schengen environment, which is only some of the countries of the European Union which are part of the Schengen environment, and how to protect the outside border of the Schengen environment. And then there's a discussion how to protect the borders of the European Union. And this will have an impact both on the digital environment and how the internet is going to be protected in this field, but it will have an impact, of course, on the real border as well. Who is arriving there? How can one ensure that, you know, as soon as the person crosses different national borders, one will know where this person is going to be. Okay. So the second issue is what they are looking at, and I'm not going to talk too much about it. I just want you to know is the how to ensure to have an autonomous European cloud. Now, there's so much talk about what does it actually mean to have an autonomous European cloud. Are there only European companies allowed? Are only companies which are located in Europe, independently where they're coming from? So there's still a lot which needs to be shaped out. And this is not new. That's not a new idea, Kubai. It came up again and again. But I believe it may take a different shape, a much more concrete shape in the near future. And then they plan as well, related to the 5G network, to set up satellites in low orbit to provide all Europeans with broadband connectivity. Currently, the level of broadband connectivity varies depending where one is, but as soon as the 5G network is functioning across the European Union, it will be a little bit more patchy. And with related to the satellite in low orbit, they as well would love to have what they call a space-based quantum cryptology, and which is, again, I'm sure Harald maybe can talk about it. It's, again, something which is not so easy in technical terms. So I would want to leave it with this. The Parliament is, as you can imagine, and all the European entities which are working on legislation, because of the COVID situation, they are not having such an easy time to shape out all of these legislation. Like most people, they work from home. Some of them are still coming, luckily, to Brussels, but not everybody. So it's a quite difficult working environment for them as well. Back to you, Kubai.
Okay, thank you. The next one I'd like to ask the Martin Bowman. I can board, the chairman. And what is ICANN can do as a platform to have some, the discussion about this topic? Do you think there is any role ICANN can play? Martin.
Thank you, Kwai. Dear Minister, dear colleagues, dear attendants, participants to this forum. ICANN's role is a technical one. It is to enable this one world, one internet, an internet that is secure, stable, and resilient from identifier position. So to make sure that around the world, stakeholders can rely on the system to access content and use the platforms that sit on top of the technical underpinnings of the internet. So that's where our focus is. And of course, governments have a responsibility to their nations, their citizens' interest in the public space, and they exert that in the online space as well. Other than the physical space, it's very difficult to put borders around it, nevertheless. So fully recognizing this sovereignty, we do see that the internet as such is affected by the ways that governments express their sovereignty, and sometimes purposefully, with specific reasons to protect, for instance, data, personal data, or security, or for other reasons, and sometimes even not so purposefully, not being aware that measures affect the internet. So whereas it's not for us to judge any government's policy or legislation, we are ruled by the multi-stakeholder model, in which governments do advise us. More than 170 governments signed up for what is called the Government Advisory Council, and from that position offer us perspectives on from a public policy perspective. It is important to see how these sovereignty and digital space and in the physical space interrelate. So from an ICANN perspective, we do, and we are keen to help legislators and regulators to understand, and therefore we also be mindful of the way the internet functions. So if new legislation and regulation policy initiatives are developed, we'd like to point out what the positive or possibly negative effects of that may be, so that will be taken into account.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Our aim is to make the internet work, basically.
Thank you. The next one I'd like to ask the technical expert, the former IETF chair, the Harold. From the technical point of view, what is the digital sovereignty really for the technical people like you thinking about? What does it look like?
Thank you, Doctor. Sorry. I'd like to take a step back on sovereignty and say, because looking at the way the internet works and what is on the internet, the best definition of what is on the internet is if I can send a packet, if one machine can send a packet to another machine, they are both on the internet. If that machine can send a packet to a third machine, it's also on the internet. Which means that the internet is roughly everywhere. Mm-hmm. In relation to sovereignty, remember that this means that everyone is on the internet. You, me, my cat, my house, my friends, and my enemies. And in the current environment, there's no way we can isolate anyone from being on the internet. If we don't want them to be there, they will still be there. So the idea of blocking off access to certain individuals' opinions or organizations, it doesn't work. The nature of internet communication is point to point. I send a packet to you, you send a packet to me. We can operate via a third party, which means that I don't talk to you, I talk to that third party. You don't talk to me, you talk to that third party. Seen from the internet, the basis of the internet. The internet does not know that you and I are talking to each other. The internet only sees that we're talking to a third party. So, seen from the internet infrastructure, there's only point-to-point communication. When Bill will probably point out the 50 different exceptions from that, but let's go with that as a basic rule. That means that when it relates to sovereignty, there are only two situations. Both ends of the communication are within the same sovereignty, and the two ends of the communication are in different sovereignties. We saw earlier, there's only one internet. It's all connected, and we're all on it. So attempting to assert sovereignty over the internet as such is playing with words. It has no connection to reality. All we can logically say is that you can assert sovereignty over the entities that communicate via the internet. So this I will return to in subsequent rounds of discussion. But for this round, I would like to leave you with this basic picture that there is no sovereignty over the internet. The term is meaningless. There is sovereignty over endpoints, entities that communicate via the internet. But in order to understand how it is possible to regulate them or not regulate them, and what the impacts of that is, we have to look at those communications and not say we want to assert some kind of more global scope. Each endpoint has to be addressed. Otherwise, we are not connecting to reality. Okay. I think I'll stop there this round. So, next speaker for now.
Okay. Okay. The next one will be ask our digital minister, Audrey Tong, and to answer the question is if in the political environment or diplomat environment and the people begin to try to talk with the digital sovereignty to Taiwan, what is our government point, our position? How are we going to deal with that?
Certainly. In the Taiwan context, people see sovereignty as something that needs to be earned by governing entities. There's a word for it, popular sovereignty, or in Mandarin, 主权在民, something that is only earned by popular support, and it's only legitimate insofar as the citizens give the not only consent, but like recognized trustworthiness. And in this sense, and because Taiwan has a very particular history, which I will elide, but anyway, so in this sense, this is not unlike the IETF view, which I quote from RFC 8890, that says, and I quote, merely advancing measurable success of the internet, such as bandwidth and latency, is not an adequate goal. Doing so ignores how technology is so often used as a lever to assert power over users rather than to empower them. So beyond fulfilling the IETF mission, prioritizing end users can help to ensure the long-term health of the internet, because perceptions of capture by vendors or by other providers harms both. The IETF work will deservedly lose end users' trust if it prioritizes or is perceived to prioritize other interests over the end users' interests, unquote. And this could actually also work as the legitimacy theory of Taiwan's democratization of the state, which I refer to as a transcultural republic of citizens. And the state, my translation, my rendition, reflects this popular sovereignty idea. So to be very brief, I think Taiwan's current liberal democracy, or if you're talking about healthcare system, social democracy, only thrives because people are willing to be governed by a essentially transcultural norm, with our 20 national languages and counting, including sign languages, asserting so-called sovereignty in a state always on top fashion, as Bill first articulated, the kind of Westphalian reality does not hold as much explanatory or convincing power in Taiwan to any individual citizen as the popular theory of sovereignty. And that is also why you can see in Taiwan most of our counter-infodemic and counter-pandemic efforts are deliberately designed to push the power at the edges, or to say, to empower people. We did the pandemic fighting with no lockdown, the infodemic fighting with no takedown. All in all, no shutdown or top-down on any kind. And this is not just about rhyming those words. This really deeply reflects this idea of power and wisdom and collective intelligence at the edges. And so to us, we may hold very different positions, but this transcultural norm, this Republic of Citizens norm, I think is shared. So any entity that would want to assert sovereignty over this kind of popular sovereignty, lowercase sovereignty, I think will be defended in very vigorous fashion, because we much prefer this current norm over the previous one, which was called the martial law.
This is the first one. We're talking about the definition of the idea of that kind of the digital sovereignty, compared with the natural or the traditional sovereignty. The next section run, we try to talk about the impact. Just like Harlow, you mentioned about the point-to-point, but we did see some country, for example, like China, build a Great Wall. So you're talking about you don't need to go through the third party. But under the Great Wall, they do have some surveillance on top of it. Maybe you don't need to go through it, but this Great Wall have a power to turn it off. The connection between this point to that point, that is, and also there is, how to build this. If a country begin to try to talking about the digital sovereignty, there will be generate certain kind of the unfair cyberspace between the two different territories. And this one, I would say, Martin, you first. Can you see what is the impact if the people began to talking about the digital sovereignty and try to define it? And what is the possible impact to, at least for ICANN? You know, because ICANN, the people always arguing the sovereignty in the GAC.
Well, and rightly so. I mean, governments have their sovereignty responsibility. At the same time, the internet and our service to the internet is to make it a neutral enabling entity. And in a way, what Minister Tang said, to have the intelligence at the edges is something we enable. We are not putting the intelligence there or not controlling the intelligence there or the content or anything. So it's really that focus on this global interoperable internet that facilitates. And whereas we also see a world in which many governments consider what they can do to ensure the internet functions in their country, even when there are cyber attacks, to take measures and things like that. Or governments, other governments feel the need to use ways to control the usage of the internet in their space. We are merely just facilitating that global interoperability of that network of networks that we call the internet. And with that, I think we try to do it in such a way that is so attractive to be part of it that you don't want to limit your participation too much, as it will harm your ability to participate in the global economy and other freedoms. So our aim is to make it as good as possible and available to all at an equal basis. And in that, also to inform governments if things they do may hamper the ability of their citizen or the internet at all to function fully, to its full ability.
Okay, Bill, from political side of view, what do you see the impact when the people raise these issues?
Well, I guess, first of all, I would say that my views on this may or may not be completely representative of political science as a discipline. It's a lot of different people around the world. But that said, I guess the first thing that I would point out is that sovereignty doesn't require any particular kinds of policies. So that liberal capitalist countries, state socialist countries, everything in between, they all have sovereignty and exercise it in ways that suit their domestic objectives. Nevertheless, states have always construed sovereignty as a right to operationalize independence via expanding state control, whether this is done directly or indirectly, as when states choose industry self-regulation or co-regulation. With regard to electronic communication and information, states have always claimed to believe that certain cross-border flows originating from external othered actors threaten their sovereignty and require strong state responses. And this approach has defined the history of global communications. So if you go back to the Treaty of 1850, the Treaty of Dresden, which was the first multilateral framework for international telecommunications, and look at the way the international regimes for telecom, radio, broadcasting, satellites, and so on have evolved over time. In every case, you see states jealously protecting their sovereign right to do what they want and operationalizing that very often through a high level of state control. In the 1970s and 80s, we had a debate that was very similar to what's going on today about transborder data flows over private networks pre-internet. And at that time, the term of art was information sovereignty. So today's digital sovereignty is just a retread of that discussion in an internet context. Of course, as Harold indicated, the original internet vision was a transnational horizontal space with end-to-end exchange of packets among willing endpoints. Didn't matter where your data was, and you're able to draw on the best routes and resources available without regard to physical location. Digital sovereignty arguably sharply breaks with this vision. It seeks to segment internet spaces on a vertical basis. So you have policies such as those pursued by China, or say Russia with its internet segment, this notion that the Russians have that there's a definable internet segment that belongs within Russia and can be controlled completely by Russian policies. Many other countries have adopted similar kinds of policies, whether it's Cuba, North Korea, Iran, Iraq, so on. And that discourse is now being picked up in industrialized democracies to justify a range of policies, especially in Europe. We see a lot of talk about the need for effectively industrial policies, national or regional champions, European clouds, as we've talked about, etc., all of which, in the view of critics, tends towards the possibility of digital protectionism. Depending on how this is done, it could prove to be short-sighted and could come back to bite us. It's difficult to reconcile some of the positions that are being adopted or discussed these days with, for example, EU positions in the World Trade Organizations on digital trade. We have a panel tomorrow morning where we'll get into that in more detail. In a less articulated and ideological way, you can see the same sort of thing in Trump's policies vis-a-vis China and TikTok and so on. This notion that stuff had to be within the national boundaries and controlled by, subject to the state's controls. If this approach grows unchecked, it has architectural implications. In the worst case scenario, we could see an internet that is increasingly configured more like the traditional public switch telephone networks, where you had, vertically segmented standalone national domains that were interconnected via gateways to hand off traffic. A shift to discrete cyberspaces of policies, contents, and transactions would increase the level of internet fragmentation, and if replicated widely, would be problematic not only at the governmental and corporate levels, but at the technical level as well. It's a sort of deglobalization of the global village, and the whole notion of a netizen would lose all practical meaning, I would argue. And we see this also in global bodies, not just national policies. In global bodies like the ITU, China and its firms, Huawei, have championed a new IP internet design that could facilitate greater, quote, sovereign control over connections. Similarly, China, Russia, and others have called in the UN General Assembly for an international code of conduct that would reaffirm the rights and abilities of states to protect their, quote, information spaces and critical internet resources, etc. In the UN General Assembly, the G77 in China have called for an international body to manage the internet's core infrastructure. Sounds like we already have one that does some of that. And a new UN body with broad-based policymaking authority. And states have called on, Russia has called on states in the UN to implement forced data localization and establish domestic servers to control their national internet segments. What's weird, I think, and I'll stop here with this, is that we have a kind of curious situation in terms of the way the discourse is evolving now, which became very evident when I organized at the IGF meeting in Berlin last year with my friend Milton Mueller, a workshop on digital sovereignty and internet fragmentation. While much of the multi-stakeholder engagement on global IG since the WSIS has been about limiting the encroachment of sovereignty-based models at the national and intergovernmental level, today many civil society activists seem to embrace various constructions of sovereignty as needed to defend against the horrors of GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and surveillance capitalism. A lot of civil society actors seem to be turning their eyes to the state for protection against the purported evils of foreign capitalism, without worrying too much about what the consequences of increasing state power at home might be. And private companies that would benefit from policies along these lines, such as we see in India, are endorsing this kind of thing. So we have a funny moment where a new kind of multi-stakeholder coalition for policies and practices that could effectively fragment the internet is coming together, which makes it a very interesting time and an unusual turn in the evolution of internet governance discussions. So I'll stop there.
Erica, what is your comment about this? Erica.
Are you talking to me? The connection was disrupted, Kuo-bai. Okay, it seems to be. So let me maybe address three issues which I believe, when you look at it from the European Union perspective, which I see shaping out as being interesting. So the one is an approach to shape this environment through regulation. The second one is through different mechanisms of control. And the third one through certification, procurement, and standard setting environment. So regulation, I believe what the European Union is going to do is to identify more mechanisms to preserve digital sovereignty as much as possible without disrupting the international context of the internet. What does it mean? It will mean that in environments where standards are not in alignment with European concept, one will look more for alignment methods. When you look back at the, just to give you an idea how this can be done, and it's not easy and quite often leads to problematic political discussions. But just to give you one idea, it could be, for example, to invent some similar mechanism like it was done in the data exchange between Europe and other entities around the globe, and in particular with the United States. And the term was Privacy Shield. It's in the moment contested. It was contested by the court, the current model, so they will have to come up with a new idea. But the basic idea is we accept what you are doing, but you have to certify to some degree that the methods you are using, which are different to ours, will be still in alignment with our basic concept. So this is one idea. The second one is control. Control is, of course, always much more difficult to ensure, and I believe we will have to look into different environments. One is the military and the law enforcement environment and the defense environment. They have their own channels, they use their own methods. But if there's an overlap, which can happen in the internet environment, an overlap to the internet as we know it, there will have to be some adjustments. The second one on the control field, I believe we will see, and the Commission and actually I was talking about it yesterday, we will see more concept evolving around how to control content that is problematic and content that might threaten digital sovereignty. Typically right now one is more talking about hate speech and the context of hate speech and how this can be controlled if it becomes problematic. But one can imagine that this concept will get extended into the field of digital sovereignty if disputes evolve around, about topics which would threaten what the European Union sees as relevant in the field of digital sovereignty. And the third basket, so the first one was regulation, the second was control, and the third one is standard setting. I believe we will see more certification processes evolving, how to ensure that different paths in securing what we call digital sovereignty can be ensured. We will have more procurement issues where certain players from certain countries may have a much harder time in exporting or in selling their product if they, one would regard their approach as not safe, or if one would say their approach is unfair to national players. So this would then touch on competition issues. So you can ensure we will see much more evolving in this environment. So these three baskets, regulation, control. I left control a little bit vague because it's hard to grasp completely. And then the last one, standardization and certification processes.
Thank you. The next one is Harold. I think for the technical operation, it's really a headache when the people try to implement so-called digital sovereignty. You know, for example, for the China build a Great Wall, you know, for technical operation, it's really disaster, but you cannot stop them, right? Harold?
Well, you can't really stop anything. But I'd like to step back one moment and mention the role of cryptography in this. Remember that the internet consists of, at the basic level, of two parties sending packets to each other. On the outside of the packet is the information that is needed to get it from one place to the other. And the basic function of the internet doesn't care about what's inside. Now, when you apply cryptography, it means that only the endpoints can understand what's inside it. And third parties can only understand if they cooperate with one of the endpoints. And this is something that you cannot enforce on everyone, because nobody has control over or sovereignty over every endpoint on the internet. So what happens in a controlled cyberspace? I'm using that term because I invented it just for this discussion. In a controlled cyberspace, the controller will insist that both ends of the communication are in the same sovereignty and subject to the same rules. And that any communication that goes outside has to go through a trusted third party. Now, of course, this requires that both ends of the communication trust the third party to respect their rights, respect their privacy, respect their commercial secrets, and so on and so forth. And the third parties may or may not be deserving of that respect. For instance, in the case of Facebook being a third party, we have people communicating via Facebook and trusting that Facebook will do appropriate things with the data that it gets. In the case of the firewalls that people try to use to divide the internet into controlled cyberspaces, we have the same issue of trust, where should we trust the operators of the firewall? We're giving them insight by deliberately weakening the protections that cryptography easily gives us. It's very cheap to encrypt. So controlling a cyberspace means that you control both ends of all communications. This is what we call intermediated systems. Systems that only work when you pass through an intermediary. The nature of intermediated systems is that they always cost more, are more complex, and more resistant to change than a system involving only the endpoints. Because if the same function could be done by only the two endpoints, bringing a third party into the conversation costs more. And that means that in an open, fair market with competition between services, intermediated systems will lose as long as they're permitted to do so. But if intermediation is imposed by force in the name of national security or think of the children or whatever reason we're doing these days, then this is a tax that all users will have to pay.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Well, because of time, I back to our digital minister. I think you heard lots of the different comments about that issue. And so, you know, what your opinion about, you know, the possible impact, and particularly from inside of the Taiwan, the governments, if somebody raised the issue, because I think about 2 years ago, there's a register, you know, the Li Hua Weiyuan, he raised some kind of issue, you know, although she didn't give the definition. You remember that, you know. So, I mean, how you can convince the cabinet, also the registered yen, say, you know, when we are talking about that, you have to consider what is the possible impacts.
Yeah, and it's not me that does the convincing, right? It's the people who eventually occupied the legislation in 2014 that did most of the convincing. So for historical background, in March 2014, a bunch of students and like 20 civil society organizations occupied the legislature because they said that in the trade negotiations with Beijing, in particular about service and trade agreement, actually which is related to their 4G network deployments. So we had this whole conversation that the world is now having on 5G, but 6 years before. But the conversation was not through representatives, is really just people who care show up around the legislation and was non-violently occupy, and of course the CHT here and yours truly and the community of civic technologists all help with the live streaming and real-time stenography and stenography, that's right, and translations and so on. And the upshot is that the final rough consensus of rejecting PRC telecom components in our then new 4G communication networks, which very interestingly is itself deliberated online using WiMAX technology, is against popular support. So when the National Security Council or the National Communication Commission and so on finally did nowadays called the Clean Path decision, it's not contested because it's very clear where the legitimacy comes from, where those ideas comes from. And so I bring up this point because it reinforces the idea of wisdom and intelligence at the edges. During the pandemic, we have seen many entities, both traditional governments as well as large multinational companies, using the counter-COVID as a very reasonable, certainly to me, more reasonable than usual, excuse, but still an excuse to collect more data than they actually need in the hope of countering COVID one way or another. But Taiwan's counter-pandemic strategy is defined by the very simple heuristic of never collect more data that we're not already collecting before the pandemic. And just this very simple heuristic gives tremendous trustworthiness, gives tremendous popular support into our counter-COVID efforts, precisely because people understand the security and privacy boundaries of those previous data collection systems. And that is really one of the key, to me, pillars in the Taiwan model, which is that the trust that is earned could be lost very quickly if we introduce anything that resembles authoritarian and intermediate system that Harold was just mentioning.
Okay. This is the last round. We try to, limit if people, you can limit your speech talk in 3 minutes. Okay. Let's go to very particular cases, it's related to the digital sovereignty. It's the data localization. This is an interesting thing because the data localization, you can see a lot of countries keep asking the data localization, but the whole idea is really against the efficiency of the internet operations. But it happened, it did. And just like Harold said, it's costly. But the problem is that some of the country or the government, they don't care the cost. We know that. They don't care about the cost, the efficiency, just want to do whatever the government leader want to achieve. So this question, I like to start from the digital minister. What is the position in Taiwan government regarding for the data localization? Do we have any policy talking about that?
Yeah, this is, to me, a very jarring term because my specialty was in national language processing and internationalization and localization of text. And in our field, text localization, the word localization means something completely unrelated to what the term localization refers to in today's discussion in data localization. In our field, text localization means to adapt to the local culture in the communication and interfaces, the way that the computer interfaces with human beings. It talks about a kind of accessibility, inclusion as its main values. Nowadays, when people talk about data localization, it seems that like opposite values are being advocated. But sometimes, of course, for national security reasons, for the reasons of law enforcement and military and so on, these reasons may be valid, but they are not the reasons of accessibility and inclusion. And so in Taiwan, I think one of the main interesting things is that, as I referred to in the very beginning, if you think about our national health care system, which is single payer with no opting out, then it is essentially a socialist system. It's a social democracy. But if you think about our credit card system or things like that, then it's certainly liberal democracy. It's market driven. And because at this moment we're still just prototyping the initial draft of our data protection authority. At this very moment, each ministry is its own data protection authority. And so just within our cabinet, we have essentially at least 10 different data norms. And those on the single pay national health insurance side will of course care a lot about the sensitivity because to them it is entrusted data in them. And they don't actually refer to them as data. This is like referring to journalism as text and journalists as text producers or text editors as text processors or things like that. Because in that particular Ministry of Health and Welfare, there's a very established ethics and norm around that kind of health data. I even don't want to use the term data, the records, the private trust that's placed to them. So of course, they only use the latest zero knowledge, or even nowadays they're considering fully homomorphic encryption and things like that that will fulfill the standards of both cybersecurity and privacy before any transmission of that particular health records. And the of course, the other philosophy could be found, for example, in the Environmental Protection Authority, which would invite each and every citizen to measure the air quality, including the PM2.5, NO2, and things like that. So to me, there is no like at the moment, single national view on the data localization issue, and I would even be very wary about calling these different data as data, because it's just like referring to research and journalism outputs and all sorts of different things as text is a kind of overbroad category.
On the floor, if you want to ask the question, you can line up on the speaker over there. And the next one, I'd like to talk to Martin. You know, the data localization is not new in the ICANN community. You know that the registry and the registrar keep asking by particular country asking for the data localization. How I can go into resolve that issue, and what is your point of view?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Basically, Minister Tang, I really appreciate the insights you share as well. It also makes me think back a little bit, this discussion about data localization. My first job for a Dutch public department, the North Sea Directorate of the Public Works Department, we were at the end of the 80s setting up all kind of networks and getting the computers in the organization at that time, really plugging into the electricity grid, and even the connections came up in that time. And when the financial department started to move towards a financial system to keep all the bookkeeping and the numbers, their fault was that they needed to have separate cables in the gutters to physically limit access to the data streams along the network. And the whole concept of virtual networks was new. And the people from the financial department felt very uneasy about using the same cables. So a little bit of that seems to be here too. But that's my personal thinking. From an ICANN perspective, it's clear that if data localization initiatives would have an impact on the technical functioning of the internet, we would stand very ready to share our technical expertise in order to help assess the potential impact on the global functioning of the internet and the unique identifiers. I mean, it's to avoid unintended consequences again. Now, what has affected us and what relates to data localization, but that is not exactly that, is the GDPR, the European Union's data protection regulation. And for instance, that has affected the way that the WHOIS system for the internet functions. The WHOIS, at the time that it took effect, had about 319 million top-level domain names worldwide, of which 80 million were in Europe. And to comply with this legislation, the WHOIS system had to be restricted to layered access, to access depending on specific legitimacy. And that has affected the way that law enforcement agencies, for instance, including agencies in the EU, have been able to carry out their work as compared to how they did it when the WHOIS system was just online available. So it's just an example of how important it is for legislators and regulators to be mindful of the way the internet functions to avoid unintended consequences. And this is also why, from the side of ICANN, we do foster, so importantly, this multi-stakeholder dialogue where technical experts, the businesses who offer internet, the businesses who use internet, but also governments come together to, and users come together to truly express the importance of different aspects and ensure that there is a good balanced way forward for this one internet.
Okay. Try to keep it short because we have people waiting in the microphone. Yes, everyone is keeping the 2 or 3 minutes. Harold, you are talking about the cost, you are talking about the difficulty, but the government don't care. They just want to implement the data localization. Then what we can do?
Well, for once, I want to speak positively about a regulatory measure, because data localization, to me, if they did it the way I want to do it, means that when you communicate to someone who's storing your data, you know the jurisdiction to which it is subject. We know that in some jurisdictions, your service provider that stores your data can be compelled to act against your interests for various reasons. Some legitimate, some not. And knowing the environment of that service provider is important in choosing one. And the implicit in the choosing one is that you should have alternatives. Choosing between Facebook is not a choice, because there's only one. Choosing between different compute servers is easy because there are many. Knowing jurisdiction is important. Choosing means that you are free to access services in many of these. So information and choice are good. Forcing to one specific is bad.
Okay. The next, Erica, what is a comment about these issues? Particularly Germany and France try to build their own cloud services for European governments.
I think we want to be careful here, Kuwait. This is a discussion which is still going on. And so I think we want to look at the different ways governments are talking about it and how the European Union is talking about it. So yes, we have documents which are signaling that some member states, in particular Germany and France, but the European Union as well is looking into how to define a localization environment. And as Harald said, it's not automatically bad, because if you are talking about how you want to shape a standard environment and how you want to ensure safe and secure data exchanges with different entities and different countries, that's all fine. It becomes problematic when it leads to, I would say, unnecessary protectionist measures, or when it creates technical barriers. So these fields, one has to be very careful. So so we will have to wait a little bit longer until we have seen more concrete proposals. So I recommend to pick up discussion again maybe next year. What we know until now is that we will, and I mentioned this before, we will have more models evolving which are talking about how safe and secure data can be exchanged. Primarily, these are going to be certification models. Country A certifies that country's transfer of data to country B is safe and secure and is equivalent to the standard which is in country A. The second one, I believe, which we will see is maybe models evolving around mirroring data. It's something we already know in some environment, like the safe exchange of data in the financial world, the SWIFT model, which is the prime center is located in Europe, but data is mirrored in the US. So this could be an evolving model, complicated, but nonetheless it could be one. The third, to avoid data localization systems, and the third one maybe could be to become more local. It's not a perfect model neither. So companies localize around the globe. It's of course something only big companies or primarily big companies can do. So you build many different data centers or many different data hubs across the globe to come to some degree. You can, you become then part of the local ecosystem. But of course, in legal terms, one has to be clear. That's not solving all of the issues. Some of you remember the legal dispute between law enforcement entity and Microsoft about data to be sent from Ireland. So you have to be very careful. You can't escape your national environment in building such kind of system. Maybe you can in the future, but it has to be defined maybe in more clearer terms than it is right now.
Bill, you are the last.
I'm done.
Bill.
Okay. Well, some of the comments, particularly the ministers, I think underscores that talking about localization can be a little bit complicated if we're not all on the same page as to how we're using the term. In the context of global business discussions around policy and digital trade negotiations, the focus has been on forced data localization. Forced is the opposite of Harold's choosing. Forced localization is the purest expression of a digital sovereignty orientation, and I think it is a direct contradiction of the original internet vision, but it's also probably inevitable. The most common form, of course, is requiring that data be locally stored or resident within a country, which, as Erica points out, for large companies is probably not so problematic, although for smaller ones it could be. But more aggressively, it can also include requirements that data be processed locally, perhaps even a requirement that it be processed by national suppliers or in conformity with unique national standards. And we've seen, for example, Thierry Breton, the Commissioner for Internal Market and Services of the EU, saying that data produced in Europe should be processed and stored in Europe. We've seen other countries that have gone further with this and imposed restrictions or even outright bans on the movement of out of country of certain categories of data or data by certain entities. China, for example, has done this kind of thing. And we've seen proposals that there should be changes to the architecture and routing of the internet that would strongly encourage or require data to circulate largely or solely within a territorial space. Deutsche Telekom was pushing this for a while in Germany, and other countries, Cuba, Iran, and so on, have tried to do the same thing. In truth, some industrialized countries, industrialized democracies, have long had selective forced data localization policies and practices with regard to things like national security information, certain financial records, and now increasingly certain aspects of personal privacy protection. Authoritarian countries have gone much further, though, with a kind of across-the-board, cross-sectoral, and sometimes arbitrary requirements. China's 2017 law, for example, requires that all data that's deemed important or critical be localized and has both conditional terms for export and bans on certain types of activities. So it becomes really quite problematic and fraught when governments are imposing those kinds of restrictions on firms. And the rationales that have often been offered for this, security, economic, legal, have been shown to be quite specious in a lot of cases, something we could come back to perhaps in discussion, since I don't have time to talk about it here. I would just say we should be mindful of the implications of this for different stakeholders, both nationally and internationally. As I say, large multinational companies could probably handle and rework their systems to deal with these requirements. And indeed, a whole industry is being birthed now to facilitate that. But for smaller entities, small, medium-sized enterprises, and especially civil society organizations, nonprofit organizations, this can be quite problematic, including from a human rights standpoint. And there's some real questions as well as to whether or not forced data localization doesn't distort the trajectory of national technological development. If you look at the history of the Brazilian computer industry since the 1970s, when they first put in one of the first forced data localization requirements, you would see what I'm talking about. And there have been a lot of studies by economists showing that indeed the rollout of forced data localization policies has reduced GDP in countries that have done it. So there are consequences, both nationally for entities within the country, for international entities, and potentially for the internet itself. And I think, you know, we don't want to see a movement towards an internet that is zones, where you've got an American zone, a European zone, a Chinese zone, and countries have to sort of choose between very different types of legal and social systems as to how they operate, et cetera, and where users are constrained in their freedom. So it's something to keep in mind. There are potential issues.
Okay.
I'll stop.
Okay. We have, you know, the audience want to ask the question. Please come and say your name, and then present your question, and then you like to ask all the speaker, or you particularly want somebody to answer your question, please go ahead. No? It's turned on. Can you check? Or you can use mine.
Hello, my name is Kathy Tai. I'm from Center for International Private Enterprise. I want to show my deepest appreciation for TWIGF to organize today's panel. It's truly enlightening to hear all the comments from all the speakers today to give a bird's eye view of, you know, the largest, most trendy challenges that we're facing in today's world. So thank you so much, all of you. So I have a couple of questions, and you know, all the speakers and commenters, feel free to pick one or all of them to answer. The first question is the digital protectionism, the idea that William mentioned. So the digital protectionism challenge we face is very similar to the international trade type of challenge we've faced in the past, I would say, 4 years especially, or even longer than that. But now with the newer administration in the US coming, it seems like the US might come back to the multilateralism. So I'm wondering if any of the speakers can comment on how can we break the protectionism type of challenge in the digital space, because Martin did mention that you need a vision of globalization that everyone can benefit and then can really prosper from the opportunities that one internet provides. So is there any suggestions that for policymakers, for private sector participants, or for INGO like my organization? And the second question is, I remember 2 years ago when I was in Paris, IGF, President Macron talked about, you know, tech giants need to be better regulated, such as, so the examples that he gave was Google, Facebook, and, you know, so on and so forth. So, you know, we do hear and also witnessed some of the measures and actions taken by policymakers to push back on these tech giants. But I feel like we haven't really seen similar measures or actions taken towards, say, Alibaba or Tencent. So my question is, basically different companies, or like, you know, in this instance, tech companies, where they come from, they actually subscribe to different set of standards and rules, right? So Twitter's, Facebook, you know, no matter how how favor or how, dislike I have towards them, it doesn't matter, but in terms of, accountability and transparency, or like the relationship they have with their own regulators in their own countries, compare them versus, Chinese tech giants, we're talking about, totally different levels. So then when we are pushing back towards tech giants, do you see the differences? Or can we use the same set of rules to regulate them, no matter the origin of the countries? The third question, if I may.
I think we ran out of time.
Okay, so thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your question. I think we have only 5 minutes left. So maybe you can pick whatever the question you want to answer, but keep it short, in hopefully 1 minute per person. Martin, you want to first? Or who want to be the first?
Okay,
go ahead.
Sure, happy. No, just I'm very honored and pleased with the discussion, and I think it's exactly right to also focus on this, to have a good understanding of how this impacts, because what do we really want for this world? And I very much realize that there's different wants and dreams and beliefs and around the world in different areas. So all we can do, and that's what we're aiming to do, is to have this internet to be there as an enabler for collaboration, for contact, for accessing, for participation in whatever is happening in the world. And we are fully dedicated to make this freely, make this available in a trusted, secure and stable way to all those who want to use it. And being Dutch, I guess there's a kind of free trade tradition where I come from. It helps me to feel very inspired doing this job with ICANN, to contribute to this One World, One Internet as a neutral facilitation form that serves everybody who wants to use it.
Okay, who want to pick up the second? Go ahead. Bill?
Yeah.
1 minute.
Okay, two very good questions. Thank you, Kathy. First of all, about the new administration, as an American, I guess I would say one has to be very hopeful. Certainly the Biden people are very much multilateralists and will certainly act quickly to end the unilateralist and self-destructive approach of the Trump administration to international affairs, broadly speaking. I imagine that that will include efforts in the World Trade Organization to help stimulate movement. And indeed, as I said, we're having a panel about this tomorrow where we'll talk about it more, but it is already, negotiations are underway, and a text that speaks to putting limitations on forced data localization will be on the table. And the U.S. will certainly strongly support that. With regard to your second point about Macron's comments in Paris and so on, I think it's true. I think you point out something rather interesting. There's when people go on and on about the dangers and horrors of GAFAM, we very rarely hear about the dangers and horrors of Chinese companies. And here in Geneva, where I live, the Chinese companies are exalted all the time. Everything the Chinese do within the UN system is held up as a model for that developing countries should all emulate. So this is somewhat of an issue, I would argue. Certainly the Trump administration's approach to dealing with China was stupid, and it legitimated actions that are exactly the opposite of what the United States has always advocated. It basically imposed this territorialist kind of approach. So I'm hoping that we will see some real changes in terms of that.
Okay, Erica.
Yeah, I'm maybe a little bit less hopeful than Bill is. The difficulties about protectionism and how global trade is shaping out it's much longer than the Trump administration. It was already and became an issue in the World Trade Organization already at the beginning of the century. So one has to be a little bit, I believe, not to be too optimistic. But and the second one on the tech issues, I think we made a major mistake. And I was involved in the discussion at the time as the speaker in the European Parliament on trade issues. I believe we made a major mistake that we gave too much exclusion to the BRIC countries. And we never put in some kind of measures when this would have to shift. And I believe if ever the World Trade Organization is back on its feet, I think we need to have a discussion about market access. It's impossible that you can have that a group of companies can have access, major companies, I'm talking about, to the globe, but it's not, the state is not allowing access foreign companies to enter their environment, or only under certain very hard restrictions. So I believe that's a discussion about market access one will have to have in the future. It's not a solution short term, but it might be one in the longer term.
Harold, 1 minute for you, please.
I just want to say, Martin said most of what I wanted to say, but let's make sure that the open internet works for the people who use it. And that's the most important thing. When the first thing to do is to have our own house in order. And that makes the alternatives less attractive. I hope they remain less attractive.
Okay. Okay, the last one I'd like to ask the digital minister. Can you help us to finalize close this session?
I try. Okay. So instead of commenting on specific policies, which may be time for another discussion, maybe I would just read you my job description, because that was kind of the conversation, a transcultural conversation really, that I was in New Zealand in the open source, open society meetings, and we were talking about much of the same things. And so I'll just simply read my job description, and it goes like this. When we see the Internet of Things, let's make it the Internet of Beings. When we see virtual reality, let's make it a shared reality. When we see machine learning, let's make it collaborative learning. When we see user experience, let's make it about human experience. And whenever anyone tries to tell us that the singularity is near, let us always remember the plurality is here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks all our remote speaker. Wake up at 6:30, wake up at 7:30, and thank you very much. We enjoy this 90 minutes talk. Although this topic is really broad and very big, you know, cannot finish by 90 minutes, but I think the audience and the people, we are quite excited to have a chance to, you know, watching and listen to your talk. Thank you very much, my friend, Martin, Harold, Erica, and Bill. Bye-bye. You can go back to drink your coffee. You want to go to sleep? Okay. Yeah. It's up to you. Okay.
Have a good local time off.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Live long and prosper.